Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 3 minutes after the hour. Still have some folks rolling in, which is good, but we'll get started. Depending on where you are, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is the fiscal year 2023 Community Project Funding Grantee Cohort Session 3 Environmental Review Process and Considerations. I'm Patrick Roberts. I'm with Civics, and I've recently had the honor of working directly with some of the CPF program analysts, grant officers, senior planning and development specialists, and environmental and clearance officers for HUD in developing some work aids for the environmental review process, some of whom are with us today, and I'll have them introduce themselves here in just a moment. But first, would like to go through some of the logistics for this session and introduce you all to some specific resources along the way. So first, as usual, participants are going to be muted during the webinar. The PowerPoint presentation will be available on the HUD Exchange. It may take a bit, but it will be available. Wanted to share with you the HUD Exchange web address here. And then also on the HUD Exchange is an Ask a Question help desk for any type of question you have on your CPF grant. And then really want to highlight for you all, in case you have not been introduced to this, so we encourage you all to sign up for the listserv, also on the HUD Exchange. This is going to be used more in the future to communicate everything new that's going on with community project funding. And we'll be putting out notifications of new resources that get uploaded, upcoming trainings, webinars, other resources that should be helpful in implementing your CPF grant. So please create an account on the HUD Exchange and sign up for the listserv to get all of the most up-to-date information that is being provided by HUD. So for this presentation, for content-related questions, please use the Zoom chat feature. You're encouraged to submit your questions as we go through the presentation while you're thinking about them. So go ahead and do that as those questions come up, and work to have those answered perhaps through the presentation, or if not, work to answer them at the end. And then if there's anything that we need to follow up on, we'll log those questions and answer them later. So I mentioned we have some folks here today from HUD. And Omri, if you could start off the introductions.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Hi, everyone. My name is Omri Gross. I'm the Environmental Clearance Officer for HUD's Community Planning and Development Programs, which includes the Congressionally Directed Spending Community Project Funding Program. And essentially, among other things, I work with the Congressional Grants Division, the Office of Economic Development, and the Office of Environment and Energy Leadership to design and implement an environmental compliance framework for this quite unique and nuanced program that is not that doesn't operate how we normally operate our HUD programs. So it's been a little bit of a challenge, and there are a lot of environmental review compliance nuances that kind of need to be understood, and that's one of the reasons that we're doing this webinar. So yeah, happy to be here. I'll be on to support and to answer any questions that you may have. I'll be doing so in the chat, so if you want to submit your questions in the chat, I'll be responding in the chat, and then afterwards, when we do the Q&A, we can do some live question and answer as well. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Connor.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Connor LaRoe. I am a program analyst with the Congressional Grants Division under the Office of Economic Development, working alongside some of your grant officers, and then also working on developing TA resources such as the cohorts, which you're all on now. So thanks for attending these. Really appreciate your attendance, and we hope that you find this session informative. And I'll give it back over to you, Patrick.
Okay, very good. Thank you to both of you, and thank you all, as Connor just mentioned, for being in attendance today. As I mentioned, I'm Patrick Roberts. I'm a consultant with Civics. I do have experience in construction management as an administrative director, responsible for implementation of new projects from project design, working with local municipalities on permitting, all the way through funding, through the completion of the project, as well as experience at a state and local government policy setting, working with states of Iowa and New York in disaster recovery programs on program management, as well as cross-cutting requirements, including environmental reviews. And being involved in construction and disaster recovery projects of all types, where federal funding is involved, you learn early that it is essential to have a foundational understanding of the environmental review process. And as Omri mentioned, the many different concepts, requirements, and regulations that weave throughout that review process. So today we're going to do a review of the environmental review process. To some, this may be a refresher, and it never hurts to have a refresher on environmental review. To others, this brief review could be their introduction to environmental review. The hope is that everyone will be able to say that they've learned something to improve their understanding of the environmental review process, and they'd be able to feed that back into their moving their project forward. This overview is going to cover a wide range of topics, starting with the question of what is environmental review, and then talking through all the way through to some of the considerations, for community project funding. So let's get started. What is environmental review? Environmental review is an analysis of impacts that a project will have on its surrounding environment and how the environment will affect the project. So incidentally, step one of the environmental review is to develop a detailed project description. And hopefully you were able to attend the project narrative cohort session that you can use to build into that project detailed description. The complete review demonstrates that HUD-funded projects have complied with all of the applicable laws and authorities and ensures that those projects provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing. An environmental review is required for all HUD-assisted projects and is a public document used to encourage public participation. And while all HUD-assisted projects require an environmental review, not all projects require the same level of effort to complete that review, which we'll take a look on the next slide. This slide includes a rough breakdown of each level of review to illustrate which levels of review are more common and to highlight capacity and timing considerations. So you can see there are a few different levels of review. Projects require different levels of review based on the nature and scope of the project activity. So starting here on the left, there's an exempt review and the CENST level of review, which means it's categorically excluded, not subject to certain laws and authorities. So it shows there, these are more like soft cost service projects, operational costs, and most maintenance activities. Under the exempt and the CNST, there aren't many laws and authorities to address. They have very limited compliance requirements and can be done pretty quickly. We often see a lot more of these types of reviews because there are just a lot more activities within this kind of scope of soft costs that we see coming through for the CPF projects. Next is the CEST level of review, which is the categorically excluded but it is subject to the laws and authorities of 58.5. These can be refinances, minor rehabilitation, single-family housing construction. The projects under this level of review are much smaller type projects than the next level of review, which requires an environmental assessment. These are the larger multifamily construction type projects, infrastructure projects, project types that go beyond just the minimal groundbreaking that of the CEST level of review. So the environmental assessment, those can take a bit longer to review. They require compliance with all federal environmental laws and authorities, including NEPA analysis, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is known. And so this, sorry, this is the environmental assessment factors analysis. And these can take longer to review, and we see fewer of these types of projects at this level. Then the highest level of review is the environmental impact statement. These are extremely rare. These are large projects, 2,500 plus housing units. Some of these can be disaster-related projects, but really you're not going to see very many of your projects fall into this level of review, not under the community project funding program. Before I move to the next slide, a couple of things I want you to take note of here is that the level of review is not dependent on the amount of funding involved in the project, but it is dependent on the level of potential impact to the environment the project may have. And two, to take note of the staffing and timing considerations, that the different levels of review will require different levels of staff capacity in terms of your local government capacity to conduct the environmental review for the CPF grant. This next slide shows us the environmental review laws and authorities, and depending on your project's level of review, which we just discussed, a HUD environmental review may have to consider a wide variety of environmental laws and authorities. This can include the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Historic Preservation, site contamination, floodplain management, noise abatement, and so on. Under NEPA and its implementing regulations, all federal agencies have a duty to assess the impacts of the major actions they propose to undertake and to consider reasonable alternatives to choose from to reduce or eliminate those potential impacts. These alternatives will be referred to later as choices. This is kind of the universe of the environmental laws and authorities that your project may have to comply with. So let's get into the regulations that govern the review process that you will all need to have completed for your projects. 24 CFR Part 58 and 24 CFR Part 50. On this slide, we're talking just about the Part 58. Environmental reviews for projects under Part 58 are completed by a unit of general local government in which the project is located. The unit of general government serves as the responsible entity and conducts the environmental review for the project. Under CPF legislation, it allows for the environmental review to be completed under Part 58 by that unit of general local government as the responsible entity, which is the default for the CPF program. We should all be doing everything that we can to encourage that unit of general local government in which the project is located in to serve as the responsible entity and to conduct the environmental review whenever possible. However, sometimes nonprofit recipients cannot secure a local government as the responsible entity to conduct their review and may need to reach out to HUD to complete the review under Part 50, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Under Part 58, the grantee recipient provides all the necessary information to the local government acting as the responsible entity to complete the environmental review for the project. This may involve hiring an environmental consultant to essentially collect, gather, and compile all of that information and provide it to the responsible entity. That will really be a call between you and the local government as to whether or not the local government has the staff capacity to conduct the environmental review, or if they need you to hire an environmental consultant to essentially do the legwork, compile all the content. Once all the documentation and content has been compiled, the local government would independently review and verify it. If the project rises to a CEST, which is the categorically excluded subject to, or to the environmental assessment level of review, which we covered in both of those a couple of slides back, the local government responsible entity will need to publish a notice of findings from the environmental review, a notice of intent to request a release of funds, and allow for the appropriate public comment period to collect and address any comments received from the public on that specific project. This publishing of the notice informs the public that this is the project that the local government is doing an environmental review for, and is informing the public of any impacts that the project may have. So after the local government waits that appropriate comment period after publishing the notice, then the responsible entity, that local government entity, would submit a request of release of funds to HUD. HUD will wait their own 15-day objection period that's required. And after that objection period, if there aren't any, HUD will issue an authorization to use grant funds. The grantee then provides a copy of that authorization to use grant funds to their grant officer, copies their environmental officer. And so once that authorization to use grant funds has been received and shared, the grantee can then proceed with the project. As you notice over there in that final area there under final steps, it does show that the grantee must also implement any mitigation if required. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of the coming slides. But this is the process for the environmental review when a project is under 24 CFR Part 58, which again is when the local government conducts the environmental review, and that's the default of the CPF projects. Now, there are a couple of differences between the environmental review process under Part 58, where the local government conducts the review, and for Part 50, where HUD conducts the review, which we'll look here on the next slide. So Part 50 is the regulation that governs when HUD conducts the environmental review instead of the local government. Again, Part 58, local government conducts the review. Now under Part 50 is where HUD is conducting the review. Sorry about that. Grantees under Part 50, grantees request that HUD conducts the review and provides all necessary requested project information to the HUD environmental officer. Again, it's still up to the grantee to provide all the information requested and necessary to complete the environmental review. The environmental officer then completes the review, conducts any necessary consultation with any environmental authorities, and then they certify and approve the review. After that, the environmental officer will provide a copy of the environmental review record to the Congressional Grants Division grant officer, who will then provide a copy to the grantee, so that the grantee has a copy of that environmental review record. Once the environmental review has been approved and the grantee has a copy of the environmental review record that has been approved, the grantee may proceed with the project. But again, as you notice in that final step, they must also implement and monitor any mitigation that's prescribed by the environmental review. So if under Part 50 and HUD is conducting the review, HUD will inform the grantee if there are any mitigation measures that need to be implemented. Mitigation describes an effort that agencies must make to avoid or minimize the environmental impacts resulting from the project. I want you to take note here in this graphic that unlike Part 58, where the local government is conducting the review, informing the public, and then requesting a release of funds from HUD, and HUD then issues that authorization to use grant funds, under Part 50, those steps are not necessary. We don't need to go through that additional approval process with HUD. So under Part 50, HUD conducts the review and HUD certifies the environmental review. It may seem like that would take less time under Part 50 to just have HUD conduct the environmental review. You just have to keep in mind that HUD's environmental staff capacity to take on a large number of Part 50 reviews is limited. So the encouragement is to have environmental reviews for CPF to remain under Part 58, where the local government responsible entity can complete that review. A quick recap to this point. The environmental review is conducted to determine if the project will have an impact on the environmental surroundings, as well as to determine if the environment will have any impact on the project. 2, there are different levels of review depending on the type of project that you have. 3, there are 2 different primary regulations that govern the environmental review process. That's Part 58 and Part 50. 4, environmental reviews must have a responsible entity. And 5, a satisfactory review process must be completed before the funds to cover the project can be released. Heading into the next slides, there are some terms that I want you to be listening for as we go forward. Legislative enactment, federal nexus, pre-nexus contract date, and choice limiting actions. Those are some of the key terms that we're going to talk about in the coming slides. So this next slide is about the date of legislative enactment. So this is an important date for the CPF project and grant, as this is the date that Congress appropriated the funds for the community project funding for that fiscal year. And the reason it's important is because any costs that are incurred or activities that are performed prior to the date of legislative enactment are not eligible for repayment and do not need to be included in the environmental review for the project. Again, any costs that were incurred or activities performed prior to the date of legislative enactment for your fiscal year is not eligible for repayment, and it does not need to be included in the environmental review for the project. For fiscal year 2023, that legislative enactment date is December 29, 2022. Next is the federal nexus and choice limiting actions. The federal nexus is the point at which the project becomes federalized and when federal environmental review requirements are triggered. Federal nexus for fiscal year 2023, again, being December 29, 2022, is the same date as that legislative enactment date. If you also had attended the environmental review session for 2022 cohorts, those 2 dates were different. For this session, it's important just to know that the fiscal year 2023, that nexus date is December 29, 2022. The grantee's local government responsible entity or HUD will be required to complete a satisfactory environmental review covering all work that took place or is proposed to take place after that federal nexus date. that environmental review needs to be completed prior to requesting payment from HUD for those activities. So a couple of slides back, I mentioned the concept of reasonable alternatives, and I shared that under NEPA and its implementing regulations, all federal agencies have the duty to undertake the duty to assess, the impacts of the major actions they propose to undertake and to consider reasonable alternatives to choose from to reduce or eliminate those impacts. These alternatives will be referred to later as choices. Well, we've arrived at that later point in the presentation. After the federal nexus date, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions related to hard costs, including commitment or expenditure of HUD or non-HUD funds until a satisfactory environmental review has been completed for the project. So if the environmental review has not been completed, then that analysis of reasonable alternatives to choose from has not been completed either. By taking any action that essentially binds the project to a narrow course or cutting off the possibility of alternatives prior to completing the environmental review, that is considered a choice limiting action. So a choice limiting action is any activity that a grantee undertakes, including committing or expending HUD or non-HUD funds that reduces or eliminates a grantee's opportunity to choose project alternatives that could possibly avoid or minimize environmental impacts. There is one nuance to this that is an important one that we'll cover in just a moment. This prohibition of choice limiting actions is true for all soft and hard cost activities and actions, unless those actions are part of a pre-federal nexus contractual obligation, which we'll also talk about in just a moment. But essentially, this prohibition on taking choice limiting actions is in effect for all soft and hard costs and activities and actions that are carried out after the federal nexus date. Some additional examples of choice limiting actions include acquisition, rehabilitation, demolition, new construction, ground disturbance. See there, clearing, grading, grubbing, entering into new contracts or commitments for hard costs for construction of any other hard cost work is a choice limiting action. These again are actions that limit your choice of project alternatives. So if you've already acquired land or a site, you're committing to that site. You're committing the project to that specific site. That's why it's a choice limiting action. If you've done that prior to completing your environmental review, it's considered a choice limiting action. Same thing would be for leasing a structure or a property, rehabbing, conducting rehab, performing rehab, limiting your choice of doing this project in another location. Same thing with demolition. So those are all examples of choice limiting actions that cannot be taken after the federal nexus until the environmental review is complete. That's the kind of the whole purpose of the environmental review, is to evaluate a site and its conditions and looking for potential alternatives before you take those actions. After the federal nexus, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions except, here's that nuance, except for activities that are part of a pre-nexus contractual obligation until a satisfactory review has been completed for the aggregated project. Although activities that were committed to under a pre-nexus contract are technically allowed, physical actions taken after the nexus may prevent a satisfactory environmental review, then would also prevent you being able to draw down grant funds. So all activities performed after that federal nexus are subject to a satisfactory environmental review in order for the project to be eligible for repayment. So to recap, activities committed after the federal nexus date but associated with a pre-nexus contract are technically allowed, will not be considered choice limiting actions. They still need to be cleared as part of your environmental review and are activities taken at the grantee's own risk. We'll talk again more about pre-nexus contracts later in the presentation as it relates to cost eligibility. So HUD's aggregation requirements under 24 CFR 58 state that the environmental review must group together and evaluate as a single project all individual activities performed after the federal nexus date, which are related either on a geographical or functional basis. This includes activities associated with pre-nexus contractual obligations that were performed after the federal nexus, but does not include related activities performed prior to the federal nexus date. Going to move into and talk about soft costs a little bit more in detail here. So soft costs, most of the soft costs, but not all, are covered under HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs. HUD conducted a nationwide programmatic environmental review for the entire CPF program that covers most, but not all soft cost activities. You can find links to each of the reviews here on this slide, as well as on the CPF landing page. And you will see when you click on that link, you'll see a list of which soft costs are covered in the project description of that environmental review record. As you can see, you'll see in the project description, it lists out all of the types of soft costs that are covered by the review in general. Planning, administrative, operating costs are covered. Maintenance activities that comply with HUD's 16-02 guidance document also linked there. You'll see the categories of maintenance costs that were part of the HUD's environmental review. So maintenance activities that comply with that notice are covered under HUD's Part 58 review for soft costs. And with the recent legislative changes that were enacted for both fiscal years last December, there is no longer a cap on how much of your CPF grant can go towards soft costs. However, if you intend to repurpose your grant to 100% soft costs, you must get approval from your grant officer to see if that's appropriate and to see if it's potentially a path forward. As I mentioned, not that soft costs covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review can be incurred anytime after the date of legislative enactment for your fiscal year grant. So that's another important reason to know that date of legislative enactment. So most soft costs are covered by HUD's nationwide environmental review and can be incurred, which is after that enactment date, which is December 29th, and can be drawn down for repayment after the grant agreement for the project has been executed. There are some soft costs that are not covered. And if you have those types of soft costs in your project that are not covered by HUD's Part 58 or Part 50 review, then you will need to complete a separate exempt or CENST determination, an environmental review determination done by the responsible entity or by HUD prior to incurring those costs. So that needs to be done before you can start incurring any of those non-covered soft costs. It's essentially just a determination that it is either those costs are either exempt or CENST. There's some compliance. There's 3 laws and authorities that, so it is one of the quick reviews. And we'll talk more about those soft costs that are not covered here on the next slide. So this slide provides a breakdown of the types of costs that are and are not covered by HUD's Part 50 review for the CPF costs. And it also provides their corresponding regulatory citation as well. So covered soft costs include environmental and other studies, resource identification, development of plans, information and financial advisory services, administrative management, inspections, testing, purchase of insurance, engineering, design costs. Operating costs are also covered, including most maintenance activities, and we'll talk about some more about maintenance on the next slide. What we mean here, we'll talk more about, the maintenance and why that's asterisk. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. Also covered are the purchase of vehicles, but not other equipment. The costs that are not covered that would require a separate environmental review, which again can be done pretty quickly as that separate review, or it can be done separate from the larger environmental review, considering the whole project, but it still needs to be put in place by the responsible entity. So soft costs that are not covered by the Part 50 nationwide environmental review for the CPF soft costs are costs such as the purchase of tools, emergency assistance necessary to control or arrest the effects from disasters or imminent threats to public safety, tenant-based rental assistance, economic development activities, affordable housing, pre-development costs, and the approval of supplemental assistance as well. Now, there's a reason that some of these soft costs are not covered by HUD's nationwide review, and it's because there is a chance they may require compliance with one or more laws and authorities, which will depend on the nature and the extent and the location of the activity, which HUD could not account for in their own nationwide review. It would be difficult for HUD to know where all the projects would be located and to know what the environmental conditions of the projects would be. HUD could only do this kind of broad level nationwide environmental review to cover certain soft costs because some of these other soft costs may require that additional compliance for assistance, for example, flood insurance requirements. So again, HUD completed the nationwide environmental review for all soft costs that HUD could clear at that nationwide level. But then there are those soft costs that may require that additional compliance that HUD was not able to ensure. So if you have any additional questions about whether your soft costs are covered or not, or if they would require their own environmental review, please reach out and discuss with your environmental officer, and we'll provide a link to a link to that resource to help you find your environmental officer. This next slide shows a table from HUD's notice on categorizing activities as maintenance for the purpose of environmental review. So if you recall from the last slide, under covered soft costs, it included operating costs, including most maintenance activities. So this is a resource that you can use to determine whether an activity is maintenance or whether or not that maintenance activity is actually covered by Part 50 nationwide review for soft costs. So you can see the table shows different types of activities and whether they are considered maintenance or rehab for environmental review purposes. So all the activities listed under rehab, which is the column to the far right, those are not covered by HUD's nationwide review and would need to be included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project prior to being performed. All activities listed under maintenance, which is the middle column, except for the ones with an asterisk near the bottom. As you can see, there's an asterisk at the very bottom there. Those are all covered by HUD's Part 50 environmental review for soft costs. And these activities can be incurred any time after the date of enactment for your fiscal year grant and would not need to be covered by a separate project-specific environmental review prior to incurring those costs. The activities marked by the asterisks at the bottom there, such as installation or replacement of carpeting or vinyl flooring, with the asterisks, those activities are not covered by HUD Part 50 nationwide review for soft costs because they may require the purchase of flood insurance if they occur in a special flood hazard area, and the cost could have exceeded the standard deductible for the specific type of structure or unit under the National Flood Insurance Program. So long story short, because these items have that asterisk activity, they require further review to determine whether they require flood insurance. They will need to be covered by a separate environmental review conducted by the responsible entity for the project to consider that specific location and the circumstance. Moving on to hard costs and how to handle work that was already under contract. So this was something that I had mentioned a little bit earlier, and it was regarding the pre-nexus contractual obligation. How do we handle that? So as you recall, following the federal nexus, no party may enter into additional construction contracts or take any new choice limiting commitments or actions, including spending funds or performing physical work until the environmental review process is complete and all necessary approvals are received. So again, following the federal nexus, no party may enter into additional construction contracts or take any new limiting choice actions until the environmental review process is complete and all necessary approvals are received. However, the one important caveat, again, is regarding work that is under an existing pre-nexus contractual obligation. So grantees are technically allowed to undertake physical work under those contractual obligations that were entered into prior to the federal nexus and can incur those activity costs that are or were performed anytime after the federal nexus as hard costs, and they could potentially be eligible for repayment. So the reason for this is because if you, as the grantee, had already entered into a contractual obligation prior to the project becoming federalized, prior to that federal nexus date, HUD really can't tell you outright that you cannot move forward with that project. You have a contractual obligation to move forward with those activities. Now, it is best practice, and HUD will always encourage this best practice of stopping all work after that federal nexus date, if at all possible, and stop until you have completed your environmental review. The reason this is because even though you are allowed to move forward and perform activities after that federal nexus date that are associated with the pre-nexus contractual obligations, grantees are doing so at their own risk. That's because all work that has or will take place after the federal nexus regardless of your pre-nexus contractual obligation status, all of that work that has or will take place after the federal nexus date must be covered by a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. That's a lot packed into that slide. There is additional insights that can be found, guidance that can be found from HUD on page 2 and page 3 of the fiscal year 23 community project funding environmental guidance and scenarios. And that is one of the resources that will be linked at the end of this presentation, but just wanted to also point it out here while we're on that subject. So we've been saying satisfactory environmental review. What do we mean by satisfactory environmental review? A satisfactory environmental review must include an analysis of the applicable environmental laws and authorities, a determination that the project activities will not result in environmental harm that cannot be mitigated. It must include complete all consultation with federal and state agencies in a manner that allows for mitigation measures or conditions to be implemented. And where applicable, a request of release of funds and that certification for the project that has been approved by the HUD CPD field office director if required. The satisfactory environmental review must cover all related project activities performed after the federal nexus, except for those soft costs that are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs. Again, HUD's already completed that satisfactory review for those covered soft costs, but a satisfactory environmental review must cover all related project activities performed after that federal nexus date. And the environmental review must show that the project will not result in any unmitigatable environmental harm. And that review must also show that the project was able to complete all necessary consultation with environmental review authorities for any work already performed. If a satisfactory environmental review cannot be completed for the project for any reason, the grantee should reach out to their grant officer to discuss other options that may be available, such as repurposing of funds, usually repurposing the funds towards soft costs. The projects that have pre-nexus contractual obligations, this can be a problem for them because of the work is technically allowed to proceed prior to the completion of the environmental review. But any work that you have under that pre-nexus contractual obligation still needs to be covered by a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. So some of these situations will require after the fact or midstream consultation with environmental authorities for the activities that have already been performed. And that's not typically how consultations are done for environmental reviews. And it's not usually how we do consultation with environmental authorities. We usually do those consultations and the environmental review prior to those activities being carried out. But again, some of these situations will require the after the fact or midstream consultation with environmental authorities for those activities that have already been performed. Okay, this next slide shows the CPF process flow for fiscal year 2023, which many of you may already be familiar with. This particular graphic can be found in the CPF guidance and scenarios document on the HUD Exchange. And this offers a visual breakdown of when both soft and hard costs are allowed to be incurred and when grantees can request payment for those activities in relation to the environmental review and grant agreement execution process. So the key takeaway here for fiscal 23 is that grantees are allowed to incur covered soft costs from the date of enactment, December 29, 2022, but these must be soft costs that are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs. If you have soft costs that are covered by that, then you can those can be incurred at the time after that December 29 date. Although HUD encourages all physical work to stop after the federal nexus until the environmental review is completed, grantees are technically allowed to incur those ongoing hard costs at their own risk after the federal nexus, but only for activities that were already part of a pre-nexus contractual obligation. And ongoing here means that you had that pre-nexus contractual obligation and you have these ongoing hard costs that you're obligated to perform. This next slide is a logic tree chart we put together to assist grantees and grant officers in quickly determining which project costs are eligible for repayment and when. This logic tree illustrates what we've just covered in the previous slide. These can also be found in the CPF Environmental Review Guidance and Scenario Docs, and there's also a link to them on the CPF landing page on the HUD Exchange. And this slide includes a list of questions that might be helpful to ask as you're stepping into your project in order to get an idea of your own situation as it will relate to repayment eligibility and environmental review considerations. Any hard cost activities performed completed prior to the date of enactment or the federal nexus, those are not eligible. And these considerations kind of summarize a lot of what we covered in the later slides in this presentation. Any soft cost activities performed prior to the date of legislation enactment and federal nexus, not eligible for repayment. Any pre-nexus contractual obligations that involve hard cost activities to be performed after the federal nexus date, best practice, stop that physical work until you have that environmental review completed, but you can proceed at your own risk. And do you have any contracts or commitments entered into or choice limiting actions taken following the federal nexus? If you feel like you have done this, if you've entered any contracts, or you've committed any choice limiting actions after the federal nexus date, you should connect with your regional environmental review officer for next steps. And this is the resource slide that I mentioned, that you have a lot of great environmental resources here specific to the community project funding program. So you have the CPF environmental review guidance and scenarios, which I mentioned throughout the presentation, which is kind of the Bible for environmental review and the community project funding. You also have various other guidance and resources on the cost eligibility chart, which we just looked at, environmental review trainings. Those are webinars that you can go into, videos that you can listen to help step through the process. The nationwide Part 50 programmatic environmental review record for the soft costs. Mentioned that more than once throughout this presentation as well. And then on the right side there, we have environmental review resources and general environmental review resources. That concludes the presentation. We have a few minutes left. I'll bring Omri back in to answer any questions or review any questions that were asked throughout the presentation.
All right, so I think I answered most of the questions in the chat. I hope if anybody else does have any follow-up questions with that, feel free to, put them in the chat or come off mute. But there is one additional question that came in from Jen Jordan Spence, which is, when can we expect assistance from our grant manager specialist to determine the level of environmental review necessary for our project? So again, in general, these community project funding grants are under what we call, 24 CFR Part 58, which is HUD's regulation, where the unit of general local government serves as the responsible entity to conduct the environmental review. So really, you should be having that conversation with your unit of general local government, request that they conduct the review as the responsible entity, and then they will make the determination as to what level of review is necessary for your project based on the activities involved. Now, if you are having trouble securing a local government responsible entity, or perhaps your local government responsible entity has some questions or needs some technical assistance, that's when you would reach out to your regional environmental officer at HUD, and they can help answer any of these types of project-specific questions, where essentially you would provide all of the details of the activities involved in the project. They'll ask you the right questions, and they'll let you know essentially what level of review is appropriate for the project activities involved in your grant. So again, reach out to your local government, request that they serve as a responsible entity to conduct the review. Then they should be able to make that determination as to what level of review after you provide all of the project information to them. If you're unable to secure that local government as the responsible entity, or if they have issues, then that's when you would reach out to your regional environmental officer to get that assistance. The next question I see in the chat is from Natasha Towles. And it says, sorry if I missed this, but when does the comment period expire and how do we find that? So there are two comment periods that you could be referring to here. Excuse me. So under Part 58, where the local government is the responsible entity, if the project and its environmental review rises to a certain level of review, right? There are several levels of review. There's the exempt level of review. There's the categorically excluded, not subject to, which we call the sensed level of review. And then there's a couple higher level of reviews, the categorically excluded, subject to, and the environmental assessment level of review. So the lower levels of review are usually activities that do not involve groundbreaking, such as some of these soft costs and other non-physical activities. But generally, if you have groundbreaking and significant physical activities involved in your project, it will rise to one of the higher levels of review. And then that when it does rise to that level of review, your responsible entity is required to, after they complete the environmental review, to post a public notice, a notice of intent to request release of funds. And after they publish that public notice, there has to be a local comment period. And so that is a comment period that is local to that unit of general local government. You post that public notice in the paper, you explain that the local comment period, how long that local comment period is, and it will depend on the level of review. So if it's a CEST, categorically excluded subject to, it can be between 7 to 10 days, depending on whether you post it in a public place or in a widely circulated newspaper. So it generally takes less time. The comment period is shorter if you post it in a widely circulated newspaper. If you post in a public place, you need to allow for that longer period of time. So for CEST, that would be 7 to 10 days. And then for an environmental assessment level project and review, that would be between 15 to 18 days, again, depending on where you post it. If you post it in a local newspaper that's widely circulated, then it only needs to be, the comment period is only 15 days. If you post it in a public place, which is not the preference is to post it in the paper, then that would be the longer 18 days. So it really just depends on your level of review. And so that's the local comment period. That's where your responsible entity, your local government, is publishing the public notice. They're waiting for any local comments, which would be sent to that unit of general local government. And then once that comment period expires, that local comment period expires, that's when the request for release of funds is submitted to HUD by your responsible entity. And then once HUD receives that request for release of funds, that's when the HUD objection period starts. And that period is always a 15-day period. Now you'll have to allow for a day beforehand to process and a day afterwards to process. So it takes about 17 days usually for the HUD objection period for you to get your authorization to use grant funds. And that is if HUD does not receive any objections during that period. And for more information on that, feel free to reach out to your regional environmental officer. They can and your responsible entity. They can definitely help you navigate those comment periods. The next question is also from Jen Jordan Spence. I'm the responsible entity. We are needing help deciding what level. I've emailed on 2-1, but we'll send it again. So yeah, so this is where you would reach out to your regional environmental officer, and they should get back to you. I know that our staff, our field staff is pretty slammed at the moment. This is a massive program. There are thousands of grantees all across the country. So it may take them a little bit to get back to you just because we're a little backlogged, but they will get back to you and they will help you decide what level of review is appropriate based on the activities involved in the project. The next question is from KP Morris. The Zoom meeting is being recorded. When will the recording be available? As I missed the 25 minutes of the meeting when it first started. So Patrick, I don't know if you want to answer that one.
I'm not sure the timing of it. It will be posted to the HUD Exchange. Won't be in the next couple of days, but I think that folks receive a notification when it is posted. And there is a listserv in the PowerPoint, and maybe even the PowerPoint was provided to folks. I thought was an idea at one point that it was just going to be provided direct to those who attended. I'm not sure. So I guess what we can do is once we have an idea of when that will be posted, we can send out some notifications on that.
Okay. And then I see the next question is, does the grant guide explain the local comment period requirements? Yes, I believe that it does go through the local comment period requirements, but also we have tons of resources on the HUD Exchange. So your responsible entity, whoever your responsible entity is, can also find all of those resources on the HUD Exchange related to the normal environmental review process. So there's a lot of resources that discuss the public comment periods. It's also in the federal regulation, the Code of Federal Register of Regulations. So yeah, that information is widely available as to how long those comment periods should be and for which levels of review. The next question is the recording going to be on the HUD Exchange? Patrick, do you know if it's going to be posted? Okay.
It will be on the HUD Exchange, yes.
All right. And then that is the last question in the queue. Happy to answer any other questions. Also, I just want to flag for you, Patrick, that some of these questions were sent in the chat to me directly, and I responded to those individuals directly. So okay. Everybody may not have seen that, some of those questions. So, and I believe you guys are going to be working on a written Q&A afterwards that you'll send out as well.
Yes, sir. And in addition to that, we do have an office hours for the environmental review that is happening on February 27th from 2 until 3 Eastern Standard, and I believe notifications will go out to potential attendees for that office hour as well. So be watching for that as well.
All right. Yeah. So no other environmental review questions have come in. So I'll hand it back over to you, Patrick.
All right. Again, want to thank you all for attending. Thank you all for the questions in the chat throughout the presentation, as well as the questions that were asked there at the end. We will get that Q&A together so that everyone can have the benefit of the question and the answer. We'll work to get those out as soon as possible as well. Thank you all again, and have a great day. Thank you.